Hello, good afternoon. Today our guest is Professor Randall Holcombe. Hello, Professor Randall Holcombe. Pronounce your name again, please, your last name.
Holcombe.
Yes, I got it. All
Yes.
right. So, Randall, today we'll be talking about capitalism and income inequality. But before we start, Randall, I'm just going to say that years ago, you wrote a piece on China and political capitalism, and I enjoyed it.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate that.
Yes, do you remember that piece?
Uh, I don't remember writing specifically about China, but I've written a lot about political capitalism.
Yeah, it was a couple years ago, so maybe you don't remember. But we're going to start off the conversation by talking about income inequality. And you produce another piece published by Cambridge University Press. It's a journal. And in the article, you looked at the relationship between free market capitalism and income inequality. It is titled Market Institutions and Income Inequality. Randall, is there a relationship between market economies and income inequality? And if this relationship exists, is that a problem?
Well, there is a relationship. Market economies, to use technical economic terms, people get paid their marginal product. So essentially what that means is people are compensated in exchange for the value that they create for others. So people who create more value for others receive more income. So there's a natural income inequality in the market economy. So you take people like Bill Gates, Steve Jobs, they created a lot of value for a lot of people. And as a result, they earned high incomes. And I think that's a good example of the inequality that's characteristic of capitalism. Now, as far as it being a problem, I don't really see it being too much of a problem. I mean, we might look at the people at the very bottom end of the income distribution, and some of them might not have the capability to earn even enough income to allow them to survive. We might want to look at that, but overall, no, it's not a problem.
All right, so this is an issue I've discussed on a number of occasions on the show. So Randall, I want you to tell us a little bit about Thomas Piketty because you wrote this paper in response to Piketty's work.
A few years ago, I don't remember the exact year, I guess it was 2013 or somewhere around there, Piketty wrote this book, Capital in the 21st Century. And in it, he has lots and lots of data showing rising income inequality, especially since the 1970s in the United States. There's some reason to question his data. I will say to his credit that Piketty published his data on a website. So anybody who wants to can look at the data. Anybody who wants to can see what data he used, where he got the data. And some people have looked through it and they've been critical of it. But I think there are other reasons to be critical, partly of his data and partly of the theory that he uses to analyze the data. One big criticism that I would levy against him is he only looks at income as far as relative shares of income. So he looks at the income that goes to the top 1%, the top 10%, the bottom 50%, and so forth. He shows that the share that's going the top 1%, the top 5% is rising. What he doesn't look at, although he has the data to do this, is the absolute income of people through all income brackets, but especially lower income brackets, because he's looking at income shares, let's say, of the bottom 50% since 1980. He says it's gone down. Well, and it may have, but at the same time, the income they earned has gone up. So they're better off, their standards of living have increased. He's criticizing capitalism because some people have lower income shares, but everybody has more income, everybody's better off. So that's one big criticism to levy against Piketty is, I mean, basically it's a theory of envy. He's saying, look, some people's incomes are growing a lot more than other people's incomes, but overall, everybody's incomes are growing. The bottom 50%, they're getting higher incomes like the people at the higher end. So that's one possible criticism. Another possible criticism is he's looking at the income shares of the top 1%, the top 10%, and so forth. But the people who are in those income groups change. So the people who are in the top 10%, let's say in 2000, it's not the same people who are the same in the top 10% in 2020. So it's really not a fair comparison that people in the bottom income brackets can move up, and they do move up. So there are several problems with the way that he looks at things. Those are two problems with the data. And so I hate to drone on and on here, but I'll also mention a problem with the theory, with the way he looks at the theory. He just assumes if you own capital, you therefore receive a return on that capital. So he's just assuming capital owners receive a return on capital. But that's not true. They have to allocate their capital in a way that it's being used productively. To think over the past couple decades, if you were somebody who owned capital in the Sears and Roebuck Company, if you own capital in Toys R Us, those companies have gone under. Just ownership in capital isn't enough to generate income. You have to allocate that capital to places where it adds to the value of other people's lives. So there are a lot of problems with Piketty's work, and so I'll stop with those few.
You can continue.
Now this is getting a little bit technical, but I think probably not too technical for your audience. But Piketty assumes that the income that people earn from capital is related to the value of the capital. He gives an example, and so let me go through his example so you can see what I'm talking about. He says, well, let's say that somebody has an apartment in Paris, and the value of that apartment is 1 million euro. And he says, let's say the interest rate is 5%. And so if the apartment's worth 1 million euro and the interest rate is 5%, you ought to be getting 50,000 euro in rent over the period of a year. And Piketty says, well, let's say the rent is only 25,000 euro instead of 50,000 euro. Then Piketty says the rent has to go up. So what he's assuming, the capital is worth $1 million. It ought to return 1 million euro. It ought to return 50,000 euro. It's only getting 25,000 euro. So the return on that capital ought to go up. He has that exactly backwards. And if you think about the apartment example, it's not the value of the apartment that determines the rent. It's the rent you can charge that determines the value of the apartment. So if the apartment's only returning 25,000 euro a year, and the interest rate's 5%, the value of the apartment's going to fall from $1 million to 500,000, or €1 million to 500,000 euro. So Piketty gets cause and effect exactly wrong when he's looking at the return on capital, that the value of capital is determined by the return that it earns. The return isn't determined by the value of the capital.
Exactly. And in your article, you note that many economists, even some of them who are affiliated to the left, argue that government is a primary source of inequality.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily the case with Piketty. That a lot of economists will claim that the government tilts the playing field. One that I'll mention is Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz. He has a book, The Price of Inequality. And in that book, The Price of Inequality, Stiglitz blames inequality on government policies. And I don't have the book right in front of me, so I can't give you a direct quote out of that book. But he says something along the lines of, it's one thing when you win a fair game. It's quite another when the rules are slanted in your favor and you can write the rules. And it's even worse when you choose your own referees. So that's paraphrasing something Stiglitz says. So Stiglitz is saying basically the problem is government is tilting the playing field to benefit some people over others. And I wouldn't disagree with him on that. But Piketty, his argument is a little different. He's saying that inequality is an inherent feature of capitalism. Not only inequality, but growing inequality is an inherent feature of capitalism. That basically, he says, the return on capital, in notation, he says return on capital, let's call it R. And so people who get their income from capital, they earn that return R. People who are working, like earning wage income, their income goes up at the rate of growth of the economy, which he calls G. And then, his basic conclusion, he says, R is greater than G. The return on capital is greater than the growth of the economy. So people who earn their income from capital, they're going to have a higher rate of growth of income, and inequality is going to increase because it's the upper income people who are getting their income from capital. So Piketty claims that inequality is an inherent feature of capitalism. Now, he doesn't like government policies. He would like to see government policies redistribute income. He'd like to see confiscatory inheritance taxes. He'd like to see more progressive income taxes. So he does argue that government policy can work to offset this. But Piketty's saying that growing inequality, rising inequality is an inherent feature of capitalism, whereas others like Joseph Stiglitz are saying, well, it's really a matter of government policy, that rising inequality is a result of government tilting the playing field.
Exactly. And there are many examples to indicate how the government can facilitate income inequality. So for instance, one economist has done many studies on occupational licensing and how occupational licensing regulations raise prices for consumers and deter the employment of ordinary people who are not necessarily highly educated.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Occupational licensure stands in the way of people holding jobs. And personally, I see no reason for occupational licensure at all. But, we can start with some of the easy cases. In my state, in Florida, you need a license to be an interior decorator. So, I mean, really, what's the harm of having somebody who's unlicensed help you to decorate your home? Like you're going to have an ugly home or something. So it's clearly just a barrier to entry. Another area where there's been a lot of publicity is hair braiding. That you need in many states, you need a beautician's license to engage in hair braiding. And hair braiders, mostly they're low-income people, they're minority populations. And to require a beautician's license excludes them from the market for hair braiding. They're not allowed to earn income as hair braiders. And the crazy thing about it is in the beautician's programs that they would be required to take, they don't even teach hair braiding. It's just clearly a barrier to entry.
Another, you may
Yeah,
go ahead. You may go ahead.
see, I would go a step further than that. If it were up to me, I would do away with all occupational licensure. So to pick something that would be more controversial, I would say you shouldn't have to have a state license in order to practice medicine. If you want to practice medicine, just open up a storefront, say medicine practiced here, I'm a doctor, and anybody who wants to can use your services. Now, on the surface, a lot of people are going to say, that's crazy. I want some quality control in the medical care that I'm receiving. I like the state to look out for me. But here's the thing with medical care specifically. I mean, actually, several arguments we could make. But here's one thing. All of the state licenses for physicians, all medical licenses, basically are governed by the American Medical Association. So the states issue licenses to practice medicine, but it's the American Medical Association that determines the qualifications, that undertakes the examinations and so forth. So if you were really concerned, I mean, let's say some politician hears what I'm saying and he says, hey, that's a good idea. I'm just going to do away with all medical licensure today. Tomorrow, anybody who wants to can practice medicine. How could you assure yourself that you'd get the same quality medical care tomorrow that you get today? Well, one way to do that is to only go to a doctor who's a member of the American Medical Association. So you have to be a physician who's graduated from an accredited medical school. You pass their medical exam. So if we did away with medical licensure altogether today, and you wanted to make sure you got the same quality healthcare tomorrow, just go to a doctor who's a member of the American Medical Association. There's already a private sector alternative that's in place. So, that's an extreme example, but I think it really helps to illustrate the lack of force in occupational licensure. Another issue you might consider is once you're licensed to practice medicine, that license is good forever. You may have to take some recurrent training, but once you're licensed, you're licensed. Airline pilots have to pass tests every 6 months to continue flying, but doctors, no. I mean, you could have gotten your medical license 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and you're still good to go. Just another indication of the lack of protection you get from medical licensure. And I'll also point out there are a lot of alternatives. You can go to an acupuncturist, you can go to a chiropractor, a lot of times you can go to a nurse practitioner. So there are a lot of alternatives to licensed physicians already. So I'm using that as an example. On the one hand, I'll say, look at how crazy it is to license interior decorators. But on the other hand, I'll say something that people think is pretty important, like physician licensure. There are pretty strong arguments that we would be just as well off without that. And it's very clear it's a barrier to entry, right? You started out saying this, occupational licensure, it's a barrier to entry, prevents people from competing with people who already have licenses. So it's a pretty bad thing all the way around.
Randall, it is evident that you have been reading Ronald Amowe. Yeah, Ronald was in favor of deregulating professions.
Yeah, well, actually, I haven't been reading him. I've come to this conclusion, well, maybe from reading other people and just from thinking about the subject.
Yeah, unfortunately, he passed, so I can't have him as a guest on my show. But Randall, we're not finished with Piketty as yet. On the left, there's the assumption that the middle class is declining, but I'm sure that you know that the middle class is declining because people are getting richer. And another objection to Piketty is that he does not account for transfer subsidies. This is often stated by some of his more vocal critics. So when we include welfare, poor people and middle class people are actually doing better off.
Oh, that's undoubtedly true. And, if you look at the official poverty statistics, it's interesting. During Lyndon Johnson's Great Society in the 1960s, he declared a war on poverty. If you look at the poverty statistics, poverty in the United States was declining from the end of World War II. There actually weren't good statistics before World War II. But after World War II, the percentage of Americans below the poverty line was continually declining at a pretty rapid rate. And when President Johnson declared a war on poverty, poverty rate was around 14% in the United States. It's still around 14%. It goes up and down a little bit, but I mean, it's interesting that in all those decades since the war on poverty was declared, that the percentage of Americans that fall below the official poverty line hasn't changed. But if you look at their standard of living, I mean, it's just gone up remarkably. You go back, go back to the 1960s when Johnson declared a war on poverty. Microwave ovens were pretty new. Only the very rich could afford a microwave oven. Now everybody has them. Nobody had cell phones, flat screen TVs, on and on. I mean, even indoor plumbing, there was a large enough percentage of Americans who didn't have indoor plumbing that the government used to keep statistics on that. I mean, they don't anymore because almost everybody has indoor plumbing. The people below the poverty line in the United States today, most of them have automobiles. They have cell phones, they have flat screen TVs, they have microwave ovens. So their standard of living has gone up pretty remarkably. When you look at the standard of living of somebody at the poverty line today, they're better off materially than somebody who was middle class back in the 1960s when the war on poverty was declared.
Randall, when we're talking about income inequality, we need to examine the unexplored benefits of capitalist progress. And I make this point all the time in my show. The internet can facilitate online businesses. When the internet is facilitating businesses, we save time and money and we use less energy. We can also talk about the benefits of financial apps. Anyone with access to the internet can sign on to Robinhood or another reputable app and buy stocks. So usually when we're talking about income inequality, some of us tend to forget the positive implications of market-based innovations like Robinhood.
Oh, that's absolutely true. And also, I mean, a lot of people are getting their entertainment over the internet these days, and not only poor people, everybody. And that's pretty much a great equalizer, right? That even people who are relatively poor have access to the same internet services that the very wealthy do. So, as more and more of our lives moves toward the internet, toward computer technology and so forth, I mean, that's a great equalizer in that really poor people can have the same advantages that rich people have.
Exactly. And Piketty and his followers again are incorrect. In a marketplace, value is subjective, and as a result, ordinary people can raise a challenge to Wall Street. Look at the Gamergate issue.
Yeah, absolutely.
And cryptocurrency, meme stocks. This is a countercultural movement.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I mean, when you look at the standard of living of most people, there's not that much difference today between the standard of living of middle-class people and the standard of living of the very rich. The gap is closing just because of what's available to middle-class people. So, it's true that Bill Gates has a lot bigger house than some middle-class person. Bill Gates has a bigger house than I do, but I'm only in one room at a time. My conjecture is my bed is just as comfortable as his. I have air conditioning like he does. I have a car. I don't have my own private jet, but the airlines can take me pretty much wherever Bill Gates can go in his private jet. Maybe not quite as convenient, but there's not that much difference between my standard of living and Bill Gates' standard of living. Now, you go back 100 years or 150 years, and that's absolutely not true. That people who had jobs in manual labor, people who basically were engaged in domestic service. There's a big difference between the rich and the middle class and even the poor. But today, poor people, I mean, they can go out to eat, they can buy food at the grocery store. And one kind of interesting statistic when you think about the welfare of the poor is if you look at the top 10% of people by income, the top 10% of people by income on average weigh less than the people at the bottom 10% of the income distribution. People at the bottom 10% of the income distribution way more than people at the top 10%. Now that's remarkable because if you go back before 1900, basically human history was the search for enough calories to survive. And obesity was a sign of wealth because only wealthy people could afford to overeat. So, I mean, I don't want to minimize the plight of the poor, but at the same time, the fact that poor people can afford to eat so much that they can overeat, that they can become overweight, that's quite a tribute to the productivity of capitalism.
Randall, I made an error. I should have said GameStop, not Gamergate. But back to your point in relation to obesity and poverty. Some time ago, I interviewed Jay Zagorski, and he said that poor people, and by poor people, we're talking about dirt poor people, they are not really purchasing fast food. But this does not undercut your argument that those who are at the lower end of the scale are able to access fast food, because it suggests that the percentage of people who are seen as poor, it is actually declining.
Yeah, and I mean, again, I don't want to minimize the plight of the poor, and we can do things to help out people who are less privileged in our society. That's probably a good thing, but really, the best thing for poor people that's ever happened, the best poverty program ever, has been capitalism. That's what's brought people out of poverty.
And you can give us some more data on the topic because you're quite familiar with the Economic Freedom of the World Index.
Sure, and you look at that index, Economic Freedom of the World Index, and basically it's a measure of market institutions. It looks at the size of government, the level of taxation, the amount of regulation that takes place in an economy, and a couple of very important things, rule of law and protection of private property rights, which go hand in hand with a market economy. And the economies that score highest on that index have the highest incomes. The economies that score lowest have the lowest incomes. The economies that have the biggest increases in that index have the fastest growing incomes. So there is a lot of empirical evidence that shows the value of capitalism, the value of market economies. And you look over, well, let's say since about 1990, and around the world, the number of people in poverty has plummeted over the past 30 years or so. And the big reason for that is the big decline in people living in absolute poverty in China. As China has moved more and more to market institutions, more and more Chinese have risen out of absolute poverty. And around the world, because of market institutions, because of capitalism, people are emerging out of poverty. Like I say, I mean, capitalism is the greatest anti-poverty program ever in the history of the world.
Randall, some time ago, I was in a room of people who lean left, and a young man said, poverty is increasing, and China and India, the decline in poverty in these countries explain why poverty has been plummeting. But again, this does not vitiate the argument that free markets are beneficial. China and India are large countries, right? And because they're large countries, if they're able to significantly reduce poverty, this is actually a plus for capitalism, not a market against the free market economy.
Well, I don't know. I mean, if you go back, I just picked the year 1990 a little while ago. If you go back before 1990 and you look at the economies that were appearing to do the best, that would have been Hong Kong and Singapore that had a remarkable rise in income since World War II. Those are small economies. So before 1990, you would have pointed at those small economies in Hong Kong and Singapore as the success stories. After 1990, you look at India and China. But I mean, I don't understand the argument that
That the,
capitalism.
no, the argument is that okay, yes, poverty has been reduced, but that's not a plus in favor of capitalism because the reduction occurred in big countries like China and India. And again, I'm saying this is not a reasonable argument.
No, I mean, I don't. So what if it? I mean, if it's occurred in big countries, so much the better, because there are more
Exactly.
who have risen out of poverty.
Exactly my point. So
Yeah.
you want, if you want a yardstick, the yardstick should be a big country, if we're being simplistic.
Well, and if you look at country size, I mean, it doesn't matter. You take the small countries like Singapore, like Hong Kong before the Chinese take over. You take big countries like China and India. You take middle-sized countries like, I don't know, maybe I'll pick countries in Western Europe. I mean, the size of the country is pretty irrelevant. Countries of all sizes risen out of poverty when they've adopted market institutions, and countries that have not adopted market institutions remain in poverty or they've slid into poverty. When you look at Venezuela, and again, you go back to the mid to late 20th century, Venezuela was one of the more prosperous countries in the world. And then they do away with market institutions, become increasingly centrally planned socialist economy, and they've slid into poverty. They're doing terrible. So you look around the world, and of course, one comparison that's often made is North Korea versus South Korea. Look around the world. Countries that adopt market institutions, those are countries that have rising standards of living. Countries that have not adopted market institutions or that have abandoned them, those are countries that have slid into poverty.
Exactly. And again, years ago, a fellow associate with the Cato Institute published a study saying that if the free market reforms unleashed in India occurred in the 70s instead of in the 90s, there would be 175 million fewer people in poverty.
Yeah, that sounds like it's very plausible.
Yes. And then the IMF years ago in the 90s said that China experienced more rapid growth after implemented pro-market reforms. So the
Yeah,
evidence is overwhelming.
yeah, yeah.
And Randall, we're still on the issue of Piketty. This is one of the reasons for having this show. We want to debunk some of his ideas. And I'm going to read an excerpt from a piece published by Stephen Rose, and he writes, Orton and Splinter's procedures led to profoundly different results from Piketty and Say's analysis. They found that after taking into account pre-tax income that included government transfers, the top 1% of earners had 83% or 85% after taxes, less income growth that was calculated by Piketty and Say's, whereas Piketty and Sayes found the share of after-tax incomes, including capital gains, going to the top 1%, that nearly doubled from 10.7% in 1979 to 20.3% in 2014. Orton and Splinter found the top share rose only marginally from 8.6% to 10.0%. So again, Piketty has inflated the successes of the very rich.
Yeah, and I think that's not the line of argument I would use against Piketty. And it's not because the line of argument is wrong. I mean, there we're arguing about, well, let's look at the data and how Piketty has treated the data and so forth. But I think the bigger flaw is his looking at income shares instead of absolute income. Of saying, well, the bottom 50%, their share of income has gone down. Let's look at their absolute income. Let's look at what they've been able to earn, and it's gone up. I mean, they're better off. So Piketty is complaining about a system that has made everybody better off, including the bottom 50%. And ultimately, when you're comparing income shares, that boils down to envy. Well, look, some people are getting more than I am, but everybody's getting more. So that seems to me to be a more significant criticism against Piketty.
You keep mentioning envy, Randall. We now have current data on envy showing that envy is driving redistribution. The research was done by Timothy Bates and co-authors.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult to comment on that in the sense that we're looking inside somebody's head. We're saying, why does this person favor income redistribution? But I think, it makes sense that a lot of it is envy. And one way to think about this, there are arguments on both sides of what I'm going to say, but one way to think about this is the people who are in favor of income redistribution, they're not saying, I want to give my income to poor people. They're saying, I want to take other people's income and give it to poor people. And so, maybe poor people will be better off as a result, although that's not clear, because if they're living off of transfers, they have less of an incentive to actually earn their own incomes. But one thing is for sure, and that is it's making the rich worse off. It's taking income away from them. So it's easy to see that as possibly a motivation for that envy is the motivation there.
Randall, it's quite well, I shouldn't say unusual or even weird. Maybe I should just say norm. This is what normal. This is what I expect. But people who complain about income inequality, many of them are quite wealthy. They don't live in close proximity to poor people.
That's undoubtedly true. Although they may have poorer people who are working for them, their domestic help, their yard services, and that sort of thing. But people, it tends to be that people who are not the richest of the rich, but people who have started their own business, they've made millions of dollars, but maybe not billions of dollars. Those people are less in favor of income redistribution. People at the very upper end tend to be more in favor of income redistribution, but really they have so much income they could never spend it all themselves anyway. And also, people who have inherited money, maybe they feel a little bit guilty. They're in favor of income redistribution. People who are in superstar professions, people like actors, professional athletes, and so forth, they might look around and think, do I really deserve all the income that I'm earning compared to other people? But really, when you look at people who, like I say, they've made in the millions, but not in the billions. A lot of them are not in favor of income redistribution. In the sense that they say, I've earned this income. I've worked hard to earn this income, and I deserve it.
And what I also fail to understand is that usually people who are against income inequality, they tend to advocate policy proposals. So not some time ago, maybe a few days ago, the New York Times ran a piece by Charles Blow, and he was writing that his aunt, she was quite indigent. According to Charles, his aunt was one of the poorest people he knew at the time, and she was his favorite aunt. And he said that beyond donating cash or giving a card, he cannot do he cannot do enough to help people like his aunt. It is better for the government to help them via a policy proposal. And I said, if you are Charles Blow, we don't know the size of his bank account, but if you are Charles Blow, assuming that one has some level of influence, well, you could start a charity to help people like your aunt. You could start a training program. The government is actually last resort.
And why doesn't he take care of his aunt?
Exactly my point. If you love your aunt so much and you're in a very prestigious position in the American society, you can afford to take proper care of your aunt.
Well, a lot of people take care of their family members.
Yeah, so
That, that
and do you know what was quite dubious when he said, "I am no longer poor, but I like to feel connected to poverty." No, you shouldn't want to be connected to poverty. When you get rich, raise the boat. Why would you want to be connected to your poor relatives? You want them to get rich.
Yeah, absolutely. And why? I mean, ultimately, if he's saying the government should get involved, well, where does the government get its money? That means
From
you,
him.
me, why should I take care of his aunt instead of him taking care of his aunt?
And he said that she's loved by him. She is his favorite aunt. That's the operative word, favorite. So if she's your favorite aunt, maybe you should invite her to live with you or pay her to take care of your children.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah, so I don't know if these pieces are satirical or maybe they just want to irritate guys like me and you, but I cannot fathom the logic of such articles.
I think a lot of people just don't put together that when the government does something, we're all paying for it. That they're thinking, I could do something, or the government could do it. And they don't recognize the resources that government uses is taking away from everybody who's paying taxes, everybody who, there's alternative things they can do with their resources.
And welfare can hamper the desire to save and invest. And Assar Lindbeck, he has reviewed the literature on welfare, and more recently, the United States government produced a report looking at the propensity of welfare to delay employment.
Well, there's certainly a welfare trap. I mean, basically, the welfare programs that we have are means tested programs. So you have to be poor in order to qualify. And that gives people an incentive to be poor, right? I mean, if you pay people to be poor, then people will respond to that incentive and they'll remain poor. And the poor look at it as an entitlement. We call it an entitlement. I mean, you go back and maybe a century ago, and we could talk about public charity, but we didn't like that term because it seemed to have negative connotations. So we talk about welfare, we talk about entitlement programs, but the name is telling. When you have an entitlement program, people who are receiving those payments think they're entitled to them.
I'm happy that you're referring to welfare, because in the past, welfare was seen as the prerogative of private people, so much to the extent that community groups would literally adopt immigrants.
Sure, and we would use the term charity, we wouldn't use the term welfare. And if it's a private organization that's doing it, let's say a church or some fraternal group or something like that, the recipients see, these people are giving something up in order to help me. So, first of all, they feel grateful to the people who are helping them. And second of all, it gives them an incentive to try to take care of themselves. But when it's an entitlement program and when it comes from the government, well, people think they're entitled to it. People think, why should I give this up? They don't see that other people are sacrificing to help them out.
Private programs had greater more programs had greater moral authority than government programs, because private providers of welfare could monitor the activities of their beneficiaries without being intrusive. Whereas with the government, we have to contend with privacy issues and human rights. But with a private institution, the private individual is saying, I have $1 million, I'm willing to give you $1,000, but you must do A, B, and C.
Yeah, I'm completely in agreement with you.
And again, we're not leaving Piketty. What does Piketty get wrong about innovation and capital formation?
Well, basically, he doesn't really have any role for innovation. The way that Piketty sets up his framework, that capital just earns a return. And actually, I'm misstating there a little bit, because if you look at the book, and I read the English translation. It was originally written in French. But if you look at the English translation, nowhere in that does Piketty say people earn income. They get income, they receive income, but he never uses the term earn. So if you own capital, then there's just a rate of return that comes to capital, and that's how capital grows. He doesn't look at the fact that people who have access to capital have to invest it in some way that is productive. So again, I mean, you look at, if you invest in a company that goes bankrupt, you're not creating value for other people. If you invest in a company, well, like Microsoft or Apple, I've used those examples before, they're creating benefits for other people, and the return to capital comes not automatically, but it comes as a result of the benefits that the capitalists are providing for other people.
Innovation is great. Innovation, the function of the market-based economy. Income inequality is not necessarily bad, and neither is income inequality slowing the rate of innovation.
No, that's right. I mean, in a sense, income inequality gives people an incentive to be innovators. If you're thinking, if I want to get ahead, I want to be economically prosperous, I need to figure out how to create value for other people. I mean, that's one of the key things in the market, is the only way people can get your money is if you voluntarily give it to them. And so in order to prosper in the market, you're thinking, how can I do well for myself? And in a market economy, it's the same thing as asking, how can I create value for other people? And if you're waiting, you're part of the wait staff in a restaurant, you want to give good service so you can get a big tip. How can I create value for other people? If you're Steve Jobs, and you're thinking, I think people would like this phone with the touch screen. So they're at opposite ends of the economic spectrum, but both the waiter, the computer innovator, those people trying to get ahead in a market economy, the question is, how can I create value for other people? That's what makes capitalism such a great system, is people have an incentive to create value for other people. That's where the innovation comes from.
In a truly productive capitalist economy, companies have a deadline, and this deadline is determined by the market. The market determines when the company becomes irrelevant. Many of the great companies in 1800, 1900, and 1950 do not exist today. So as an entrepreneur, one has an incentive to lower prices. One also has an incentive to create more value by investing in R&D and capital equipment. So again, Piketty is depicting a caricature of the entrepreneur. But did he even mention the entrepreneur in his text? I don't remember seeing that.
No, there's no entrepreneur that basically you own capital and therefore you get a return on your capital. He doesn't even have a good place in there for entrepreneurs who are getting higher than average returns. He does in places rail against people who are the really high income earners, like athletes and corporate CEOs and so forth. But those are people who are earning labor income, not capital income. So there's a little bit of an inconsistency there in Piketty. But again, we can pick at his book, but I think the biggest flaw is he doesn't look at the absolute increase that has occurred across the board in people's incomes as a result of capitalism.
And for someone who is framing moralistic arguments, Piketty is not surveying the literature on the relationship between morality and markets. If you're going to criticize capitalism on economic and moral grounds, then you ought to marshal a comprehensive critique of the moral argument in favor of capitalism.
Well, his arguments are entirely data driven, that he collects up data and he looks at the data, and from the data, he concludes that capitalism, an inherent characteristic of capitalism is that it generates increasing income inequality. So it's all data driven. It's not an ethical argument. So in the end, we might say we don't like income inequality, therefore we don't like capitalism. But really, all of his analysis is data driven.
Randall, I think that a bigger challenge, I think that a bigger point to this confirm Piketty's thesis is the role of inheritance in capitalism. Today, most people who are truly affluent earned actually earn their wealth. It is not inherited wealth. 80% of America's millionaires are first generation millionaires. And we have known this before the research was done by Tanner. There is a paper by Stephen Kaplan on billionaires. Inherited wealth actually grows quite slowly. And Piketty's argument has become quite alluring because of the role of inheritance. He presents inheritance as something that is static. So wealthy people will always increase wealth. The poor will become poor, and the rich will get richer. But this is not true. It doesn't comport with the data.
No, and he doesn't have any data along those lines. I mean, his data all is looking at the top 1%, the top 10%, the bottom 50%. And what he doesn't account for is people move from one category to another. That a large percentage of the people who are in the bottom 50% today are not going to be in the bottom 50% 20 years from now. And similarly, people who are in the top 1% today are not going to be in the top 1% 20 years from now. But he doesn't account for that mobility from one income group to another. He just looks at the top 1% as if those are always the same people, but that's wrong.
And based on the span of time, if you were in the top 1%, let's say in 1800, today people who are in the top 20% could be far wealthier than those who are in the top 1% in 1800.
Oh, absolutely. If you, I mean, I tell my students, every one of them is materially better off than anybody in the history of the world up to 1850, maybe later than that, but at least up to 1850. That my students have access, these are college students, they have cars, they have air-conditioned apartments that they're living in, they have cell phones, internet access, telephone, they can travel around the world on airlines. And the richest people in 1850, I mean, they were limited to horse-drawn travel. Railroads were starting up a little bit in some places, limited to horse-drawn travel, no air conditioning, no electricity. They had to take the food that was locally available instead of being able to go to, restaurants where you could get a variety of food, or grocery stores that have food from all over the world. So college students today are materially better off than even the wealthiest people back in 1850. So sure, they don't have as big of homes, but where they're living is air conditioned. It has a television. Would you rather have servants who are cooking your food, or you can just go to the grocery store and you have such a huge variety and pop something in the microwave? Would you rather have a flush toilet, or would you rather have servants who are emptying the chamber pot? So, I mean, it's just, and that's not including the healthcare benefits, right? That all of the advances have been made in medicine. I mean, my college students today are so much better off materially than anybody in the history of the world up to 1850. And I try to emphasize that to them.
Randall, I was just about to say, well, today I can go into my kitchen and put food in the microwave. I don't have to cook it.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have such a variety that you can choose from. You go to the grocery store and, as opposed to whatever is available locally and in season, you get stuff from all over the world. And, not to mention the great variety of restaurants that are available to most people. So just the variety of food, the convenience. I mean, it's just remarkable to think of what capitalism has done to people's standards of living and how much it's advanced the standards of living of just average people.
The greatest advantages of capitalism are evident in the leisure economy.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And you look at the range of entertainment that's available today, and you know, you can turn on your television and watch in the comfort of your home. You know, watch all of the best movies, best television shows, and you have access to those same entertainment options that the wealthiest people in the world have. That recorded music allows you to listen to the best musicians in the world. Whereas if you go back before mass media, well, the wealthy could attend plays, they could go to concerts, whatever was locally available, and but the poor might not be able to afford that. Well, today everybody has access to the best entertainment options thanks to mass media. So yeah, that's pretty remarkable, and it's a great equalizer.
And technology has not only reduced the cost of entertainment, in some cases, these costs have been eliminated. Look at the concept of an Amazon Fire Stick. You don't need to go to the movies anymore.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you know, just again, you know, thinking about how this is equalized across the income distribution. I mean, you and I have the same options for musical entertainment, movies, television shows, as Warren Buffett has, as Bill Gates has. You know, we have. It's been a great equalizer, especially as far as entertainment activities.
Because of capitalism and the internet, we're having this conversation on Zoom. If I were
Absolutely.
around in 1950, my YouTube channel wouldn't exist.
Yeah, that's true. And long distance communication would be problematic. I mean, I'm old enough that I can remember when it was very costly to make a long distance phone call. So, you know, people would economize on that. Now,
WhatsApp.
yeah, I mean, now it's free to call almost anywhere. I mean, really, when I was in college, I never, ever once talked to my parents on the phone because long distance phone calls were so expensive. I used to send them a weekly letter, you know, tell them what I was up to. And I didn't tell them everything. And I would get a weekly letter back. That's how we communicated back then because long distance phone calls were so expensive. Now my kids will call me, you know, from all over the country, you know, just for almost trivial things, you know. Hi, Dad, I'm at the hardware store and I'm trying to decide, should I buy this? Should I buy that? So it's just pretty remarkable the way the advances in communication technology have enabled us to communicate so easily, so readily with anybody. So, you know, thinking about your friends, your family, but you and I, we've never met personally, and here we are, zooming together.
Yeah, and capitalism has also lowered the cost of branding. Small businesses have immense overhead expenses. With Facebook, you go online and create a platform.
Sure, absolutely.
And what I also like is that the internet facilitates connectivity. So I'm a YouTuber. I can get a mail from a random person saying, hello, Lipton, I'm a branding expert, and I would like to enhance the quality of your channel
Yeah,
instead
yeah.
of putting out an ad in the paper.
No, I mean the technology is just remarkable how it has advanced, and not only for people, upper income people, not only for a privileged few, but for everybody.
Exactly. It has lowered the cost to become a capitalist.
Sure.
We're all traders today.
Yeah.
This
Yeah.
is this is what technology has done. Randall, are there papers exploring the leisure consequences of market-based innovations?
I don't know of any to recommend off the
Need,
top of my head. So it's a good question, but I don't know.
neither do I. But these are issues that economists like yourself should be researching. Well, maybe not you because you have done enough to educate us about the benefits of capitalism. Maybe this is the work of a mainstream person.
No, I think that's a good suggestion. That would be an interesting thing to look into.
Yes, but Randall, we have been having an excellent conversation, but unfortunately, I have to wrap it up. But I am really enjoying our discourse.
Well, thank you for inviting me to have this conversation. I've enjoyed it too, and I'm happy to spread the good word about the virtues of markets and capitalism.
Yeah, and before I go, Randall, some years ago, I went to the Cato Institute. I was a beneficiary of a seminar. So I went to Cato. Yeah,
Yeah,
a
yeah.
couple years ago. All right, then,
Well,
bye.
Cato is a good organization.
Yes, bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much, Lipton.